Obrigado. Bom dia. Tudo bem? We've exhausted my Portuguese vocabulary. I could try. You know, I was once in Portugal visiting a friend, and he said, well, don't worry, you speak Spanish, right? So pretend you're a Frenchman who got very drunk and speaks Spanish. More or less, you have Portuguese. But we have some wonderful translators, so I'll try that as well. Are we okay? Do people need a break? Or do you need to stand up? Or we're okay? We're okay. All right, wonderful. Let's press on. So first off, I'd like to say thank you to Chris and to the Instituto Beja team and to Sylvia for putting this together, for this phenomenal report, and for having me here. And thanks to all of you for coming today. I would also like to say you're welcome, because I brought with me from England some beautiful weather today. It's the least I could do, right? We had to bring you something from England. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about putting the concept of systems change in practice from the lens of philanthropy, even though I come mostly from a practitioner background myself, and try to put it in the context of what we learned from the report that we just heard about from Sylvia. First, just a little bit of background about myself and the Skoll Center, because I think you'll see the way that my experience has infused the way that we approach these issues at Skoll. So I am, even though I'm working in a business school, I'm a social justice doctor, a global health doctor who's worked for 25 years to try to make healthcare, high quality healthcare, a right that's accessible to everybody everywhere, regardless of where they come from or who they are, the color of their skin, etc. And I've worked all around the world, but particularly spent the better part of 15 years in Rwanda, helping first as a junior doctor in training and then leading an organization and doing research and even working in government to help the people of Rwanda and the government to rebuild their society after the 1994 genocide, which took the lives of 1 million people in a country of 7 million within 100 days. And destroyed all of the institutions and infrastructure and economy, etc. And I came as a young doctor because I was dedicated to the idea of trying to make HIV and AIDS care accessible to everybody. That's why I went into medicine, etc. And what I quickly learned during that work, actually there was a community health worker in Haiti who told me as we were going out in this program, you know, taking the pills, the HIV pills, without food is like washing your hands and then drying them in the dirt, because you can't keep them down, right? And that was for me the first lesson in understanding that the toolkit that I thought that I was bringing or that we were bringing to improve health couldn't work on its own, because it's not about healthcare. It's about how does poverty get into the body and cause disease? How does racism get into the body and cause disease? And so suddenly I realized that actually all of these things are interconnected. We talk about poverty traps, right? Most of the things that I learned that matter didn't come from medical school or public health school or Harvard or Oxford. They came from community health workers. And that was the first lesson, and that's when I started to become a systems thinker. Now, over those 15 years in Rwanda, the country moved from being the poorest country in the world, where the life expectancy from birth was 28 years, to a rapidly growing economy. Life expectancy more than doubled in a generation. Now it's almost 70 years. The economy has tripled, and inequality by Gini index has improved. It's the only country in the world where you see rapid economic growth, improvements in population health, but decreases in inequality. So most of the benefits of this development went to the poorest. And people come from all over the world when I was in Rwanda, when we were there, saying, how did you do it? How did they do it, right? It's not me, this is the country. What's the secret? And the secret, or the most important agreement, is equity. After the genocide, the new government that came in had to rewrite the Constitution. Maybe that sounds familiar, right? After decades of oppression and division and war and violence, we need to build a new country. We'll start with a new constitution. And what they did was write equity into the constitution of the country so that every government program has to be designed in order to benefit everyone, especially the poorest. in society. It became almost a legal requirement. That became embedded into the way that the country works. And this was because of a recognition that all of the violence and the genocide that was perpetrated, which had its roots in colonial history and all of these things, was about two different groups pitted against each other. And the desperation of poverty and inequality were the conditions that made large-scale violence possible. And the thinking was, if everyone's lives are improving, if every family has hope for the future, these kinds of things won't happen anymore. And equity was put at the center of everything we did. We used to say, if we can't do it everywhere, we won't do it anywhere. And we'll always start in the hardest to reach communities first. And what I've learned was that equity is not just the moral thing to do, the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. Equity can drive innovation. And I'll say there are three ways that equity can do that. The first is it expands our moral imagination. I've spent my whole career listening to people say, I'm sorry, that's not possible. You can't do that. AIDS treatment for poor people, you know, the drugs are so expensive, it's very complicated, they don't have infrastructure, those Africans, they don't have watches, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then my response was, well, if this was your sister, your mother, your child, would you give up so easily? Or would you fight? Or would you try to find another way? That's what the equity mindset gives us. Instead of saying no, we're forced to ask, how? How can we think and operate differently? How can we find solutions? The second way that equity can add value for you is that it brings new ideas and new expertise into the system. I said already, everything I learned that matters, I learned from community health workers, not from fancy universities. And once upon a time, those community health workers, if they existed, didn't get a voice. They were told what to do, and it was the doctors coming in or the outside experts coming in. And only when we sat together and understood their lived expertise that, we built this beautiful program that was offering free tuberculosis treatment for anybody who wanted, and patients were still dying. But why? We gave everything. Everything is free. And the community health workers said, well, you have to understand that people need to walk 8 hours to get here. So it's 3 days just to come and visit to the clinic. And there's no one to tend to the fields. There's no one to care for their children. They don't have enough to eat. They share the pills with their mother, their sister, etc. So the idea of bringing different stakeholders together and understanding that all of these different ideas can actually drive innovation is incredibly important. And then finally, sorry, I'm checking my notes here. Yeah. Equity is a means of building trust and creating the conditions for collaborative action. We heard a little bit about trust-based philanthropy and trust issues. Let's face it, we're suffering from deficits of trust in all areas of the system, right? The communities don't trust the NGOs because they've been exploited by different NGOs for generations. The NGOs don't trust the funders don't trust the NGOs, nobody trusts the government, nobody trusts business, et cetera, et cetera. We need to start to stitch this back together because we all have to be working together. And this approach of bringing people together around the table and working together builds the conditions for collective action. It's not an easy process, but it's a relational process and it's a start. So this isn't in my slides, but putting equity at the center will get you a long way. After many years in Rwanda, I moved to the UK about 5 years ago to lead the Skoll Center for Social Entrepreneurship. And it was a big shift, and it wasn't really a shift at all in some ways. I'll talk for a moment about what we do. The Skoll Center has been around now for 20 years. We've just celebrated the 20th anniversary of the Skoll World Forum, which is held in Oxford every year and brings together about 1,500 social entrepreneurs, change makers, funders, governments, etc. Really in community to share ideas and exchange. And we do three things. We teach, and we do research, and we bring people together and try to build communities of practice. And even though it's called social entrepreneurship, I would say think of it as social entrepreneurialism. What we're trying to do is create entrepreneurial leaders and entrepreneurial ideas that can help to drive change. I don't care if you're a social entrepreneur, or an intrapreneur, or an extrapreneur, or something else. I don't care if you're in a not-for-profit, or a for-profit or something blended, or in fact, many of the best social entrepreneurs I've worked with have been civil servants in government. It's about the mindset and the ways of working, and that's what we try to promote. And so we teach students from Oxford and all around the world, as well as executives, around entrepreneurialism and systemic change. We do research, which I'll talk more about in a few moments, and then of course bring folks together. Now, why systems change? Why does this matter? Antonio Guterres said that we're facing, this was last year, the greatest cascade of crises in our lifetimes. Of course, he's talking about COVID and climate change and the conflicts we're seeing in the Ukraine and all of the ripple effects we're seeing. And yet, solidarity is missing when we need it the most. You know, in 2020, as an infectious disease doctor, when COVID was just starting, I got very involved, as you can imagine, was asked to go on television and speak about what was happening, what does it all mean, etc. And what I said back then was that COVID will be a dress rehearsal for 21st century problems. Remember the refrain we used to always hear, none of us are safe until all of us are safe? Right? The same is true of climate change. The same is true of so many other issues that we face. And I would have thought a few years ago that only an alien invasion or a pandemic could actually bring everyone together. And it didn't exactly work out that way. But I think there are a lot of green shoots and a lot of things that happened during that time that helped to show us what's possible when we really step outside of our comfort zones and we work together. But we also saw that a whole bunch of systems that we took for granted collapsed. Right? It wasn't just a health crisis. It triggered an economic crisis. It triggered a hunger crisis. It triggered an education crisis. It triggered political crises, reckonings with racial injustice. And I remember the first time I walked into a supermarket and couldn't find any toilet paper and all the other things that we sort of take for granted, milk and eggs, etc. And I never stopped to think about where those things come from. I would just take for granted you could walk into a shop, you could buy those things, you can order them on your phone, whatever. And then you stop to think about it, and there are hundreds of different steps that have to happen to get that toilet paper on the shelves. And this value chains or the supply chains are so fragile that one or two things goes wrong and the whole thing's come crashing down. Well, it turns out in education systems that had been underfunded for decades, the exact same thing happened. Systems are invisible until something goes wrong. And that's why I think there's promise in this moment, because we all saw it. We've all lived it, right? I say systems are invisible till something goes wrong, unless you're those who are victimized by the system. Of course, you've been living with that for a long time. It's no surprise to you. But for many of the rest of us, this is the first time we can see these things on the surface. So I think there's an opportunity. But the thing is that thinking in systems is really hard. It's really complicated because everything is connected to everything. It would have been a lot easier as a young infectious disease doctor to just focus on diagnosing HIV and giving out the pills and moving on to the next patient and hoping everything would work out and that I did my job. And not worrying about how far people had to come to reach the clinic, not worried if they had any food to eat with their medicines, not worried about others in their family who we may not be reaching, etc. But the reality is, if you want to do the work, you have to be able to see all of that. You don't have to do it alone. You've probably heard of this proverb of the 7 blind men and the elephant. So these 7 men, in this case, they're blindfolded scientists. They're encountering an elephant for the first time. They can't see, obviously. And so we see one who touches the tusk and says, oh, yes, it's a spear. And another who touches the tail and says, no, this is a rope. And someone else touches the ear, grabs that big ear and says, wow, it's a fan. The thing is, we only see the part of the system that we're most proximate to, right? And so some of us are working in healthcare, some of us are working in education, etc. And we operate with those blinders on. We miss all the different interconnections and interdependencies. What does that mean? We get our diagnosis wrong, to use medical speak, and if our diagnosis is wrong, our prescription, our treatment is going to be wrong as well, right? So to see the whole system, we need to think and operate differently and work with some humility. We also need to understand that it's the perspectives of many that are going to help us understand these interdependencies and relationships. And the reality is, no matter how good your intentions are, if you go into a situation and try to attack a problem this way, you'll probably create some harm somewhere else in the system or unintended consequences. And I'm sure all of you have seen that. We could spend a week talking about unintended consequences. So what we're trying to do at the Skoll Center, and what I'm really concerned with is, in my work, I've been able to see and witness examples of systemic change. The global AIDS movement is a great example, one of the greatest examples of large-scale systemic change in our lifetimes. The US civil rights movement, I'm not that old, but another great example. But how is it on the other end, if you're setting out to try to help address a wicked problem, how do you go about doing that? The traditional models of social entrepreneurship don't teach that, right? They're based on Silicon Valley venture models, create an organization, scale it up, and change the world. Sometimes that works, usually it doesn't. So we all talk about systems change, and what I realized was that nobody actually knows really what it means, and really nobody knows how to do it, or very few. So we've been trying to understand through our research on social change organizations, philanthropists, what are some ways to articulate pathways to creating systemic change that might help you understand how you want to go about setting off and doing this work. I don't know if you can see this, there's these two guys on a blackboard with a complex mathematical equation, and one of the middle steps says, then a miracle occurs. So we're trying to unpack that black box because that's not math, right? So what is systems change? Systems change is effectively a large-scale, changing the way that a majority of players involved in a system or a society think about and address a problem, basically. What makes systems change different than other ways of working? By the way, we'll share these slides, so this isn't class, you don't have to take notes, you can have all of this. The first thing is we're concerned with root causes, not symptoms. For another medical analogy, if I'm seeing a child in my pediatrics practice and the child comes in with a fever, I could give the child paracetamol and bring the fever down and she'll feel a lot better, right? But am I fixing the problem? No, she's going to come back the next day sicker because I've only been addressing what I see on the surface. What we need to do is understand what's causing the problem in the first place. Is it an infection? Is it some other problem, etc.? We need to be thinking about this in the same way, right? It's not good enough to provide food for those who are starving, though we should also be working to eliminate the conditions that make hunger possible. It's not enough to provide schooling for kids who have been out of education. We need to eliminate the conditions that make those things possible. That's what systems change is about. Doing so provides, hopefully, change with lasting effects because we're changing the way the system operates. We're changing the rules of the game. We're changing power dynamics. We're changing the way we as a society, our mindsets, the way we think about the world and what we value. In the United States, the wealthiest country in the world, where we spend $4 trillion a year on healthcare, up until a few years ago, 15 to 20% of the population didn't have health insurance. Which is crazy, right? We spend, many times more than any other country on healthcare, but yet could accept a society in which millions and millions of our neighbors didn't have access to healthcare. And there was a law passed called Obamacare in 2012, which was 2010, a messy, imperfect law that everybody kind of hated. And what it did was partially solve the problem and create access for some of those people who didn't have access to health insurance. But that wasn't the important thing. The important thing was, and we didn't see this at the time, but you're starting to see it now, it changed our mindsets. As Americans, we're very individualistic, right? I work hard, I earn my keep, I take care of my family, you take care of your family. Now, in most parts of America, if you go around and talk to people about health insurance, it seems crazy that anyone shouldn't have health insurance. So we've started to see this subtle mindset shift that, you know what, it's stupid for us as a society to allow some other people not to have access to health care, especially when they just come into the hospital when they're really sick and we still have to pay for it. So that mindset shift is a very subtle systems change that wasn't the direct intent of the law, but is a more important impact. So I talked about transforming characteristics of the system. It's not just through direct service, Donella Meadows is the sort of godmother of systems thinking for social change, and she talks about leverage points. The ways to transform a system are about changing the rules of the game. Those could be policies, norms, procedures. Those could be changing flows of resources and information, changing power, and most importantly, changing mindsets and ways of thinking. And that's where you get the most leverage. A really important thing, and Sylvia touched on this, is that systems change is not a linear process. It's a circular process of learning and trying and evaluating and changing and evolving over time. And so you can't do systems change with a log frame where you say, here's our 18-month plan. We'll do this intervention, then we'll do that intervention, then we'll do that intervention, and then we'll have a celebration and declare victory. Because you don't know, because there are so many other interdependencies. You'll get some things right and some things wrong. And you have to stop and learn and evolve and change again. We've studied 110 of the biggest social change organizations in the world who won Skoll Awards for social entrepreneurship to try to understand their systems change journey over 10, 15, 20 years. None of them were doing in 2018 when we studied them the same thing they were doing when they started out. Their business model had to evolve over time because what the system needed from them at different points in time changed. So we have to be nimble and flexible and have a learning mindset. That does not fit well into the domains of traditional philanthropy or traditional development or impact measurement. And in many ways, all the stuff we could talk about around social finance and impact investing, et cetera, wonderful as they are replicating a lot of the same systems and a lot of the same fallacies that we've seen for decades with international development. The problem is it's just really hard to do this stuff. And then finally, a recognition that no single person, no single institution can solve this on their own, and there's never a magic bullet. So anytime someone says, I've got the thing that is going to solve this wicked problem, don't believe them. Okay, now we've studied this from the philanthropy side as well, and I think this is a useful one that I want to spend a moment on. And we've got a short working paper on our website that I would encourage you to check out. So we worked with 31 of the biggest foundations and philanthropy organizations in the global north and the global south, and then about 50 leaders in the space, and tried to be as inclusive and diverse as we could to try to understand how are the big funders in the social sector thinking about approaching systemic change. Okay, so this is a way of articulating where the field is and where the field is moving. It's not advocating for any one of these approaches, but it's just saying if you are setting out to think about how to move the needle on health equity, what are some ways that you might think about your theory of change, for example? So let's go through these five approaches very quickly. The first is empowering change makers. This is a common one. You see this a lot with the Acumens of the world, with the Ashokas of the world, the Skoll Foundation, others. This is what Jeff Skoll likes to call investing in good people who do good things. The investments could go to organizations, but it tends to be a little bit focused on the entrepreneur. And the idea is trying to catalyze, right, their ability to drive change at a bigger scale. And it overlaps a lot with the second one, which we're all familiar with, scaling up. This is really the closest to the kind of traditional Silicon Valley VC model. Remember, social entrepreneurship came from entrepreneurship, which is a business school thing. The Skoll Center is in a business school. We work a lot outside of the business school, but there is that way of thinking. The idea is that you have a great organization who's doing this, and you want to help them go like that, right? So you have a great intervention, a great technology, a great product. Let's spread it everywhere. Let's move fast and break things, or move fast and build things, or whatever. And that, I think, has driven a lot of what we've seen in philanthropy over the last couple of decades, and even now. It's very seductive, right? Typically, it's over the medium term, and it's trying to reach as many people as possible, often as quickly as possible. It works sometimes. What I would argue is that it's rare to have an intervention that can be so decontextualized that if it works in rural Rwanda, it'll work exactly the same way in the favelas of Rio and exactly the same way in rural Haiti. they have to be contextualized. So it's not as easy to just plug and play in the same way it is with technology. And that's the limitation of scaling up. The third approach is coordinating actors. This is using your positioning, sometimes your funding, but also your convening power to bring together different actors in the system to share ideas, share experience, begin working towards a common vision and a common goal. That can be bringing actors into the system who may be benefiting from the current status quo, who may not want to see the kind of change that you want to see. And certainly, hopefully, involves bringing in those who have no power in the system, but have a lot of interest in seeing change, right? And so we've seen a lot of efforts like this in orchestration. Catalyst 2030 would be an example. The Skoll Foundation now is doing much more as an ecosystem actor, trying to drive change towards protecting democracy or preventing the next pandemic, where they're actually doing very little in terms of funding. What they're doing more is curating conversations and curating a network that hopefully catalyzes new kinds of collaborations. So this one is focused very much on the interdependencies within the system and trying to make change there. Fourth is exploring and experimenting. This is understanding that there's no one intervention that's going to make change, that's going to solve the problem on its own. So let's seed a whole bunch of different experiments, and let's try some really crazy ideas. We need a little more crazy, Saul and I were talking about before, and see what works, and then we can try to find ways to grow and build on good examples. This is very much rooted in a learning mindset, a kind of experimentation approach. And then finally, scaling deep. The only way to scale your impact is not just scaling to more and more people. You can scale deeper within the existing community or region or ecosystem in which you're working. And this is where some of the systemic approaches that co-impact, for example, are engaging in are really starting to come to the fore. This is about understanding institutions and political economy and power and trying to drive sustained change in that way. So that was very brief. There's a nice little paper on it that I encourage you to check out. The thing here is there's no right answer, and there's probably not one single answer. This just gives you a vocabulary for thinking about ways that you might start engaging on how systemic change happens and how you maybe want to approach this, depending on your positioning, depending on your goals, depending on your resources, and other things. But it's a start. So I think, just about lastly, I'm going to wrap up here, just to come back to Sylvia's wonderful report and some implications for philanthropy in Brazil. We need a systems change here as well. We need a systems change in philanthropy, and we need a systems change within the social sector and how we operate. So that means we have to start with ourselves. Systems change has outer work, but it also has inner work. And so working to cultivate a systems mindset, working to cultivate a mindset where we have the humility to understand we don't have all the answers. We may not have many of the answers. We have the ability to walk in other shoes, to have our own preconceptions and our own biases challenged without getting defensive about it. And saying, oh, thank you for helping me see the world in a new way. Maybe that'll work. Let's try it. That's number one. Number two, moving from a short term, we need to get results in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, to a longer term mindset. The kinds of change we're trying to see is this is the arc of history. So we're talking 15, 20, 25 years. Doesn't mean we can't do things that are going to have benefits immediately, but trying to think about what are the shared values and shared vision of where we want to get to. What's the future possible? And then how do we get there and work our way backwards and understand what are the preconditions for that kind of future state and what are the steps that we need to take. It's a different way of thinking. And again, it's not conducive to traditional ways of grant making. So we need to think and operate differently. Have to be able to think collectively. It's not about an individual grant, but it's how your portfolio of investments and actions are all contributing in different ways to these pathways to systemic change. It's not thinking about what I as an individual or me as my foundation or NGO can do on our own, but what we can catalyze within the collective. We need to be willing to cede power. So it's not just about having the humility to understand that we don't have the answers, but that I've studied this for a while, and I don't think I've found an example of a large-scale systemic change that happened without some kind of reconfiguration of power dynamics. And that's why it's so hard, because someone's got to give up power or lose power, and nobody likes that, let's face it. It makes this hard, but that starts with us. And then finally, ask yourself every day, are we being bold enough? Are we pushing hard enough? Are we making space for crazy ideas? Remember, risk capital, philanthropy is best positioned to provide risk capital than probably any other source of funding, but tends to be often the most conservative. So are we being bold enough? Are we pushing ourselves? And then finally, you can have folks like me come in from Oxford and others, and we'll share our experience and we'll share ideas, and that's all great. This is a big, wonderful, diverse, messy, innovative, cool country, and the way forward has to come from within, and it has to come from communities first. So look outside to us for ideas and maybe some inspiration and things you could try, but look inward for the answers, and I think you build the future starting that way. Okay, thank you. I'll leave you with this quote from Jonas Salk, the inventor of the polio vaccine. Ask yourself, maybe go back to Cynthia's point that philanthropists sometimes are struggling with, well, I kind of want to give all my money away, but I feel a responsibility to our children and our grandchildren, our grandchildren's grandchildren. My response would be, well, what is it that you want to leave behind? Is it that you want to make sure you're leaving enough money behind? Or what kind of world do you want your grandchildren's grandchildren to be living in? Maybe that's the legacy that you need to think about. And that's the kind of inheritance. So what can we do to be good ancestors? Thank you very much.